Very good morning to all the participants. Uh, we are going to, with the title, The Individual and the Ideal. This is drawn from the book Commentaries on Living, published in the year 1958. Published in the year yeah, I think everybody is on mute, or
I have to put it on charge, but if I take it there,
Vinay, can you put everybody on mute?
yes, I'm doing it.
Yeah, please. This is from the Commentaries on Living, part 2, I think. This is there in the part 2, the individual and the ideal, if I remember it right. Yes, second series. This is from the second series for Mr. Ravinandan. Yeah, can I continue? Yeah, okay. So we are taking up this topic, the individual and the ideal. As I said, it's very interesting that this is from the book Commentaries on Living, which was published in the year 1958. To just give you a background about this particular talk, these are actually what Krishnamurti has noted down based on his interactions with people. This is not actually a dialogue, but it appears as a dialogue because what the person asking the question, he'll put them in quotes, and what he answers, he gives in detail without the quotes. So this is how you can make out who is the questioner and who is the speaker here. That's J. Krishnamurti. To put this into context, the person with whom Krishnamurti is having a dialogue appears to be a person who has been or who is very active in the social and political movements of that day. And he has been a freedom fighter and been to jail also in connection with the freedom fight. And he is putting a very interesting question in the sense that what he's talking, we can correlate it to our present situation also. And it appears as though things have gone from bad to worse. Now, therefore, the questioner says our life here in India is more or less shattered. We want to make something of it again, but we don't know where to begin. I can see the importance of mass action and also its dangers. I have pursued the ideal of non-violence, but there has been bloodshed and misery. Since the partition, this country has had blood on its hands, and now we are building up the armed forces. We talk of non-violence and yet prepare for war. I am confused as the political leaders. I am as confused as the political leaders. In prison, I used to read a great deal, but it has not helped me to clarify my own position. And then to simplify the whole thing, he says, can we take one thing at a time and somewhat go into it? And he asks Krishnamurti, first, you lay a great deal of emphasis on the individual, but is not collective action necessary? This is the background. I'll just share the screen and show you the PPT. Is the PPT visible now? Yeah, okay. Now, in answer to the question of the individual, the response of Krishnaji is the individual is essentially the collective and society is the creation of the individual. This has been his emphasis right through. We can see that starting from in 1935 onward until his death in 1986, he has always been emphasizing that you are the world and the world is you. In this sense, we are essentially not different from anybody else, and the collective that is generally referred to as the society. So in fact, in our earlier discussions, we have seen that Krishnamurti says that the I, what we call as the individual, is actually a product and a result of the environment. And the I, the so-called I, and the environment, they keep on interacting upon each other, and maybe in some ways create the conflict also while fortifying each other. So a lot of conflict arises because the I appears to think that it is separate from the society. So the I is actually not, the individual is in no way different from the society, and this is what he is emphasizing here again. And he is making a mention here that the individual is essentially the collective, and society is the creation of the individual. After all, you and me and a few others like us, we are the one who create the society. Now, while saying this, one of the most important factors on which we are going to dwell for quite some time is what he is mentioning in the next line, where he says, though the environment conditions the individual, he can always free himself, break away from the background. This I have put it in italics and in a different color to emphasize the importance of this statement, which we need to go into very carefully. We need to go into this statement very, very carefully, because this is actually, according to me, the crux of the whole subject on which he is talking. See, as we have seen, while Krishnamurti emphasizes that the individual and the society are not different, the individual and the collective are not different in any way, and that the environment conditions the individual. The individual is conditioned by the environment in the sense that because of his interaction with the environment, he is a product of that environment, where he is gathering all kinds of experiences, converting that experiences into knowledge, and storing in the memory. And that is how the I is created. If I want to say, if I seriously question myself and want to find out who I am no different from the environment. I am no different from anybody else. Maybe qualitatively and in some superficial aspects I may be different, but essentially I am a product of what he calls as the experience, knowledge, and memory. It is, see, these experiences that are gathered could be something which are different for each individual, because he is set up in a different, superficially different environment. And there is something called as his own temperament also. And earlier we have seen he brings about the idea of inheritance, the racial inheritance. So all this put together is the me. But the most important point which we need to understand here very clearly is that though the environment conditions the individual, now the individual has the capability, and the individual is capable of freeing himself and breaking away from the background. We can discern one very important factor from this, because in certain of his talks, Krishnamurti has very clearly said that I am not a part of this whole thing that is going on. The so-called environment, the so-called society, the so-called world outside you, which you are thinking as something separate from you, and that you are no different from this environment. But when it comes to himself, he has very categorically, he has said that I am not a part of this. Hello. Somebody needs to
Vinay,
mute.
Vinay, please mute. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So you see, he has very clearly stated in one or two places that I am not a part of all this nonsense that is going on. That exactly reveals his state of consciousness from the level at which he is talking, and he is making it very clear that as far as he is concerned, he is totally free from this background. And that is why he is emphasizing on this aspect and saying that the individual can always free himself and break away from the background. In fact, that is what is required also. The whole purpose of our study is to see the truth in this statement and how to realize that truth. As long as we are a part of this environment, in some way or the other, we are responsible for the whole mess in the society, in the country, in the nation, in the world. Whatever you may consider outside you, we are contributing to that problem. We are contributing enormously to that confusion as long as we are a part of it. Truly, a person can contribute to the environment in a very positive manner. When I say environment, I mean the society and the world at large, which includes us also. But a person who is truly free from this, he is the one who can actually do the greatest contribution to the environment and to the society. Because as long as we are a part of this society, we will not be able to function independently of the society, and we will only be adding to the confusion. So it is very important to free ourselves from this whole thing and break away from the background. The individual is the maker of the very environment to which he becomes a slave. This is another important aspect. We created the society, and somehow we have become a slave of the society. All our actions are based on a particular idea of what will the society think about me? How should I look respectable in the society? How should I conform myself to this society? How I should thrive in this society? But all through, we are actually becoming a slave to this society. We are acting according to the dictates of the society. We are acting in accordance with what we think that the society wants from us. In that context, he is emphasizing again that he has also the capacity to break away from it and create an environment that will not dull his mind and spirit. While we are the makers of the environment and we have created the society, he says as an individual, you and me also have the capacity to break away from it and create an environment that will not dull the mind and the spirit. Because when you are a slave to the environment, obviously your mind and spirit are dulled because you are only acting in conformity with what you think the society wants. And in fact, if you go into it very carefully, you see that nobody knows what exactly the society wants. Each one thinks in his own way, based on his own conditioning, based on his own culture, background, language, region, religion, his food and whatnot. Everything is conditioning. So in this conditioned environment, we think that we have understood society, but that understanding is only in our own limited way. And therefore, we do not even really know what exactly the society wants. If you compare the society in the 1950s, 60s, and then 80s and 90s, and now in the 2020s, There's a vast difference. There's a tremendous difference in the attitude of people, in the behavior of people, in the desires of the people, in their relationship with people. Somebody who has been there in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, he can very easily understand what was his relationship with his parents, with his elders, and what is the relationship of the children here with their in 2020 with their parents and with their elders. There's actually a vast difference because we really do not know what exactly the society wants, and we go on creating more and more confusion, and in that confusion something is thrown up, and that we accept as the norm of the society, and then we continue to live. You look at the fallacy of the whole thing. There's a great fallacy in this, because there's nothing like society per se outside me. It is me and the relationship with which I have with people. It is a relationship with the things around me that I have that continuously reinforces me and the society, and I am a product of that. If there is degeneration now, I am equally responsible for it. If you consider that to be degeneration, if somebody thinks that it is very liberating now, even that I am a product of it. So perception of individuals keep changing, but we have created a society which we ourselves have seen over the past half a century or so. It has dramatically changed. That also was called as society. This also is called as society. So what exactly is society? It is not something stationary. It is not something static, but it is as dynamic as we are, and we are creating this whole process. So the emphasis, again, as I say, we have to catch hold of this aspect that Krishnaji is very clearly and emphatically telling us that the individual can always free himself and break away from the background, and he has this capacity, and he has also got the capacity to create the environment where his mind and spirit are not dull. This has to be very thoroughly grasped by us, because that is what we are going to elaborate about. What he is going to talk about is an elaboration on this particular aspect. How the individual is important that way. Because after all, any change that has to come can come only from the individual. I cannot go outside myself and think that I'll be able to change the whole world. It can't be done. It has to start with the individual, and therefore the next sentence is again very important. The individual is important only in the sense that he has the capacity to free himself from his conditioning and understand reality. Other than this, there is no other importance to the individual. Please let us understand this also. The individual is only important to the extent of realizing his capability to free himself from his conditioning and really understand the truth of the matter, what he calls as reality. Other than that, the individual has no importance. I cannot claim some privilege, or I cannot claim some uniqueness to myself in exclusion to the world. Living in this world, I cannot have some exclusive privileges to myself and think that I am totally different from the society, because that fallacy is what persists in each one of us. In fact, unfortunately, if you see some of these, management theories and people who promote, individual abilities, who are focusing on self-development and other things from a worldly point of view, they keep on pointing out that you are unique, you have exclusive capabilities and all that. That may be at a superficial level, yes. Somebody may be very smart. Somebody may be very creative. Somebody may be able to, do mathematics very well. Somebody may be very good in physics. Somebody may be very good in music. That's okay. So he's not talking about the individual from that perspective at all. The individual, as compared to the world, is actually no different from the world, because all the differences are only at the superficial level, but not deep down. Deep down, we are all the same in one way or the other, because we all work on the same background, where we are all confronting the same kind of problems, and where we are coming across the same kind of issues in life. So the individual has got no other importance other than realizing the fact that he has the capacity to free himself from all his conditioning and understand reality. Individuality that is merely ruthless in its own conditioning builds a society whose foundations are based on violence and antagonism. Please understand this. If I am pursuing my own goals, my own ambitions, my own desires, my own attainments, and everything related to me, always, then I become ruthless. Obviously, I'll become ruthless because I don't mind brushing people aside, stamping on them, stepping on them, and then eliminating them, removing them from my path. So, an individuality that is merely ruthless in its own conditioning, the conditioning is this. The conditioning is that I need to achieve something. I need to be better than everybody. I need to be better than my peers. I need to be better than my classmates. I need to be better than my colleagues. I need to be something different and something unique. And my achievement should be something great. All this is a pursuit which is divisive by nature, which is essentially divisive. I am dividing myself from a psychological point of view. Please understand that he is not denigrating achievement in any form. He is not denigrating, or he is not belittling the effort people put in things, or effort the people put in research and scientific or technological development and all that. He is not denying all that. He is denying the psychological barrier, the psychological conditioning which we create, where we think that our achievement, our success, our happiness, our enjoyment is based on pursuing something excluding everybody else, or continuously comparing oneself with the other. This is the problem. Now you are doing something for your own sake. You feel happy about doing something and you are doing it. Say you are happy composing music, or you are happy painting. That's not an issue at all. Or you are happy pursuing your own research. That's not an issue at all. But the moment your psychological aspect comes into picture, where you want to be better than somebody, where you keep comparing yourself to somebody, where you feel envious or jealous about somebody who is in the same field or who is also doing the same work, then the psychological conditioning becomes very powerful, and we become ruthless with that kind of conditioning. And therefore he says, individuality that is merely ruthless in its own conditioning builds a society whose foundations are based on violence and antagonism. The moment I exclude myself, or I think I am different from everybody, the moment I want to compare myself with somebody, the moment I am envious or jealous of somebody's achievement, or the moment I think that somebody is trying to overtake me, somebody is becoming richer than me, or somebody is becoming more famous than me, this becomes an aspect of violence. There's actually violence at the psychological level, and that will manifest in the world in the physical level also. At the physical level also, the same violence will manifest. See, in fact, it is sometimes so ridiculous if I think back and think of people, what they have been saying. I know a couple of people who are what do we call as professional religious gurus, all these Swamijis and all. One gentleman whom I have met, he was very clearly saying, comparing himself with some other person who is also in the same field. And in fact, he was much more famous. And this man was saying, we started together, we all belong to the same group, but that fellow somehow got lucky and he has got more followers than me. So being in, see, but he talks about all the so-called spiritual scriptures, but inside he's again envious and jealous of his own friend or colleague in an ashram where he became famous and this man couldn't become as famous as he was. You look at the fallacy of this. Isn't it ridiculous? A person who is talking about, say, Bhagavad Gita or something, is continuously, brooding in his own mind and comparing himself to somebody and saying that he got lucky or he somehow managed to get more followers than me. This is the basis. This is the basis of that conditioning, and that breeds violence. That breeds antagonism. That is the issue we have to understand very clearly. We have to understand very clearly. Otherwise, what happens is we'll fall into the same trap. We think we are not that, but we are actually much more than that, and we are stuck much deeper into this morass of the societal conditioning. Societal conditioning is individual conditioning also. It's not, they are not two different things actually. And therefore, we need to understand what is the importance of the individual. As an individual, the only thing I should be aware of is that I have the capacity to free myself from this conditioning. That's the only thing. Otherwise, an individual is nothing other than his relationships. What is an individual in isolation? Does an individual have any importance in isolation? Does he have any importance? In isolation, you have no importance. Therefore, he says the individual exists only in relationship, otherwise he is not. So the individual exists only in relationship, otherwise he is not. And it is the lack of understanding of this relationship that is breeding conflict and confusion. The individual in isolation is nobody. In fact, he has no identity at all if he is in isolation. His whole identity is based on relationship. Who I am, what is my name, what is my caste, what is my community, what is my wealth, what is my relationship, who are my parents, who are my grandparents, who are my children, what is the status I hold in society, what is my earning, what is the power I wield. All these define an individual. If all these are taken away and there is no relationship, then obviously, he is nobody in isolation. So therefore, an individual exists only in relationship, whether to other people, whether to other things, whether to his own ideas and concepts and beliefs, whether it's his friends and relatives and family, and his wider circle of in the society, and what he thinks he is from that point of view. So you see, because we do not understand the nature of this relationship, that lack of understanding, that is what is breeding conflict and confusion. If I am very clear in my mind, if the issue is very clear to me that I as an individual exist only when I am relating myself to something or somebody. In the absence of that something or somebody, I am actually nobody. Once this understanding dawns, then the individual is no longer important, the relationship is more important. So how you behave with people, how you look at people, how you deal with people. If the individual becomes important, immediately I only think about how to use the other person for my benefit, how to use the relationship for my own furthering my own interests. Therefore, the focus has to be shifted from the individual to the relationship. The understanding of the relationship becomes much more important. Once you understand that relationship truly, then you will realize, and that relationship, that understanding of the relationship dictates how one needs to behave. That is precisely what we have to understand. Otherwise, this lack of understanding gives overimportance to the individual, and in every relationship we create a conflict. In every relationship we create a confusion. You see the point now? This is what has to be very clearly understood. Once you understand this, then the true nature of things are clear to you. Now, an interesting issue is raised. If the individual does not understand his relationship to people, to property, and to ideas or beliefs, merely to impose upon him a collective or any other pattern only defeats its own end. What happens is, if you do not understand the relationship with people, the relationship of the individual to the property, the individual to his own beliefs and ideas, then what are you doing? You are imposing a pattern. You are imposing upon oneself and also upon the society a pattern. Once you impose a pattern, it is self-defeating. So therefore he says, to bring about the imposition of a new pattern will require so-called mass action. See, what happens is, if you see the world history, in the world history, there has been, especially in the 20th century, the two dominant ideologies of democracy and communism. We're not judging which is good, which is bad and all that. We're not going into it. What I'm saying is, one country or one nation had imposed a particular pattern on somebody, and another nation or another country has imported another pattern on another country. That means you have imposed a pattern on the masses. Now, in order to impose a pattern, you require mass action. You require to bring about a frenzy in the masses. You have to bring about a kind of collective thinking on the part of the masses. You have to create a slogan. You have to promise them heaven. You have to promise them something out of the world. You have to do everything. Then what happens? You have now imposed a pattern on the masses. Now, if you are interested in imposing patterns on the masses, then only mass action has got any importance. But he is trying to point out the falseness of the whole thing and saying that who has created this new pattern? This new pattern has been created by a few individuals, isn't it? A few individuals, or one or two individuals in certain cases, or only one individual also in certain extreme cases, has created a pattern, has created a new pattern. And this is not something theoretical. Please don't take it as something theoretical. We have seen this happening. This happened in the 20th century repeatedly. A single person comes up and creates a mass frenzy, and he imposes a new pattern, and he brings out a slogan, and then people blindly follow. The masses blindly follow. But do you see the fact that these patterns are also invented by the individuals, and the mass is mesmerized, by the latest slogan. The slogans and the promise to create a new utopia. But then, if you see the beauty of it, the mass is the same as before. The mass remains the same. Only the rulers change. Only the rulers change. It is the new rulers, new phrases, new priests, new doctrines. This is very much true. You can see that there is no substantial change in the situation of the masses, in the position of the masses. Whichever political ideology it may be, whichever political dispensation it may be, the mass remains the same. What changes is a new ruler has come. He has brought some new phrases, new ideas, new doctrines. So that is what it is. It is in no way different from any of these things. Do you see the beauty of it? And you can correlate this to the latest situation also. I don't want to give any examples of any of these things, but because that will become prejudicial for us. They become prejudicial. I am not against or for anybody. As Krishnaji says, we are not against or for anybody. Can you see the falsity of the whole thing? The whole situation. You have to see the ridiculous nature of the whole thing. And we have fallen a prey to it. We have fallen into the trap. And therefore, he very clearly says that the mass is fictitious. Anybody who talks about I am doing it for the welfare of the world, welfare of the masses and all, is actually talking nonsense, because whom do you consider as mass? Is it a homogeneous group? Is the mass a homogeneous group in any way? It's as heterogeneous as it can be and as divisive as it possible, because everywhere you find only divisions and divisions and divisions. For example, when some government or some institution comes out with some policy, you will find that different classes of people, the class of say small traders, big industrialists, small workers, unorganized labor, everybody has a grouse. Everybody has a problem which is unique to him. So where is this mass? There is no mass as such outside there. The mass is only a fictitious creation of the exploiter. And therefore, see, way back in 1958, Jiddu Krishnamurti has made the statement that the mass is fictitious. It is a convenient term for the exploiter and the politician to play with. If this sentence is taken out and read to somebody, he would very much agree that this is the position in 2020. But whereas this is the statement he made 62 years back in 1958 or even before 1958. That is the insight Jiddu Krishnamurti presents to us, which is universal in nature and across the boundaries of time. Across the boundaries of time. Can you just, one second, I'll need to connect power to my laptop. Yeah. So do you see fictitious nature of what you call as the mass. There is no homogeneous mass outside there. You cannot resolve everybody's problems. You cannot solve everybody's problem because each one has got his own problems. And there is no single formula which can satisfy everybody. Even if God descends down here and wants to say, I want to fulfill everybody's wishes. This minute I have one wish, next after half an hour I'll have another wish, or tomorrow I have a different wish altogether which contradicts today's wish. So understand the fictitious nature of things. It is only the individual who matters, and only to the extent of bringing about a transformation in himself. It can't begin anywhere else. It has to begin here and now and in the individual only. That's why, again, this sentence is very, very important, and I have put it in blue and italics. It is the transformation of the individual that is of the highest importance, but not in terms of a pattern. The transformation cannot be based on a predetermined pattern. It can't be based on what you think you already know. That's not transformation. That's only a small change or a modification in our own existing life. If I change the table from one corner of the room to another corner, it is not transformation. It's only readjustment. Because there is a pattern and I am moving within the pattern. As long as I am moving within the pattern and in terms of that pattern, there cannot be any transformation. So that transformation of the individual is of the highest importance. Our present morality is based on the past or the future, on the traditional or the what ought to be. Our whole morality, our whole social customs and systems are based on the past or the future. It has been like this in the past, so that we need to continue. In the past, it was like this and I think it is bad, therefore I need to change it and adopt a different kind of pattern in the future. So either you base yourself on a tradition or on the idea that something ought to be like this and therefore I bring that change. So our whole morality, that's why he says, see, he was sometimes very ruthless in his statements also. He would say, the present social morality is immoral, he used to say. The present social morality is immoral because you have not understood what true morality is. You are either blindly following the tradition and glorifying the tradition, or you are blindly condemning the tradition and thinking that it ought to be something different, or it should be something different according to your ideas, and that creates the future. From today onwards, we adopt a different idea, a different pattern, because I think that the past pattern is not correct. Therefore, he says, you are not doing anything great. You are only taking the past and putting it into the future. The what has been projects the what should be. The ideal is homemade. It is projected by its own opposite, the actual. The actual is something which is unedifying. It is not acceptable to me, which is unpleasant. So I'm not willing to dwell upon the actual. I immediately create an ideal. I immediately project the opposite of it. Krishnamurti very often used to say, And that is the next sentence. He says, being violent, the mind projects its opposite, the ideal of non-violence. The fact of the matter, the actuality is that you and I are violent. And he goes to the extent of saying that imposing one's ideas on somebody else is a form of violence. He went to the extent of saying, please don't follow the speaker. He would repeatedly say, please don't follow me. Don't accept me. But examine what I'm saying. You can reject it. No problem. You may simply reject it. That's not the issue. The fact is that we are violent. By being violent, actually, I'm not very happy with that thing, because the moment I discover that I'm violent, it disturbs me. The what is always a disturbing factor. It goes on disturbing me. So I'm not comfortable with the what is, the present. Immediately I shift my focus to what I need to become, what I ought to become, what I should become. Therefore, the moment the mind realizes that it is violent, it creates its opposite and the ideal called as non-violence. Why should somebody practice non-violence? Let's put a question the other way around. Why should I practice non-violence unless I am violent? Isn't it? I will go in search for happiness when I'm not happy, isn't it? When I'm depressed, when I'm sorrowful, when I'm suffering, then only I think of going out, getting out of it and then becoming happy. The fact that I am going after something clearly shows the lack of it. So if I am pursuing an ideal called non-violence, it actually means that I am violent, isn't it? Do we realize this fact? If I am non-violent by nature, if I do not know anything about violence, then where is the question of pursuing any ideal of non-violence? I am what I am. If I am pursuing something, it shows that I consider what I have to be not the right thing, or I am lacking in something, and therefore I need to acquire it. In order to acquire it, I create an ideal outside myself. And then I think now I need to make an effort to become non-violent, which is actually a fictitious thing. It's actually fictitious. What is important is to understand the what is. The nature of my own being. If I am cruel, if I am jealous, if I am envious, if I am angry, if I am violent, if I am greedy, that's a fact. I should be able to examine that fact. But because I don't like the fact, I immediately create an ideal out of it and then say one needs to be non-greedy, one needs to be non-violent, one should not have jealousy. That's only a projection. That is something which is not there, which is not real. So this is the nature of the ideal. The ideal is created out of a mind which is stuck in a particular state of being, like violence or something else. Out of that, it creates an ideal. This has to be very clearly understood. Otherwise, we'll only be doing some window dressing, some minor adjustments here and there, and then we'll be trying to behave in a manner which is socially correct, which gives an impression to people that he is sophisticated and he is very pleasant and he is very cool and all kinds of things. But actually inside I may be a person which is totally different from what I am projecting to you. That is the importance of this statement. That is why the title of this talk is The Individual and the Ideal. We will examine this aspect of ideal much more closely and see. He says, is not the ideal an avoidance, an escape from the what has been or from what is? This is a question which we need to deeply ponder over. We have to live with this question in a way. We have to live with this question and understand the truth of it. Is not the ideal an avoidance, an escape from the what has been, my past, or from what is, my present? Then he makes a much more forceful statement, and he says the ideal is a marvelous and respectable escape from the actual. A man of ideals, if we go by what Krishnaji is saying, should be a totally degraded person, because he only has ideals to project but not to live. He only has ideals to project but not to live. Therefore, he says the ideal of non-violence, like the collective utopia, is fictitious. The ideal is not something there, isn't it? You have projected it. You have created something as a great ideal and you want to reach it. As long as you have not reached it, it has no reality. It has no existence. It is only simply an idea, a concept you have created. Therefore, he says the ideal, the what should be, helps us to cover up and avoid the what is. We are covering up the what is. We are simply avoiding. We don't want to face the what is. And the ideal, as he very clearly says, is a fictitious thing. It has no reality. So the nature of the what he calls as the ideal has to be, gone into very deeply. See, in a different context, Krishnamurti says, if you are with total attention, if you are able to see the what is, from that total attention, the true transformation comes. The what is reveals the whole thing. In a way, he says, the attention to what is the death of what is. It will end there, and a different energy, a different state of being, a totally different intelligence will operate, where you are able to perceive the whole truth of it. See, there is a great possibility, there is a great probability of misunderstanding Krishnamurti. Because right from our schooling days, we were taught that one needs to be idealistic, one needs to have ideals, one needs to have great goals, one needs to have, ambition and motivation and achievement and all those things. Isn't it? Now here is a man who comes and says that all your misery, all your problems, all your suffering is on account of that. Is on account of that. And therefore you are stuck. Therefore you are stuck. But he's pointing out to something much deeper. is pointing out to something much deeper, because we are examining, or we are willing to examine something which is fictitious and not the real. We are willing to consider something fictitious to be tangible and avoiding what actually is tangible, which is the what is. The pursuit of the ideal is the search for reward. You want to be rewarded. You want to achieve something. You want to attain something. The ideal is a compensation, a fictitious state which the mind has conjured up. You see the point? The ideal is a compensation to the what is. The ideal is always a search for a reward, some benefit. Something has to come out of it for me. Therefore, the mind is always thinking in terms of what is in it for me. What is in it for me? I am unwilling to make an effort to understand that unless I know that I am going to get some reward out of it, some benefit out of it, some advantage out of it. Unless that is there, you are not willing to take up an ideal at all. But as he repeatedly says, the ideal is a fictitious thing. Like the mass. The masses are fictitious. There is no mass there outside which you can identify and say, this is the mass. Who is the mass? The collective we is again a fictitious thing. Because each individual is pursuing his own pleasures, his own problems, his own confusion and his own conflict. So the reality of this has to strike us hard and sink in deeply. Otherwise, we'll get stuck here itself and there won't be any progress. There won't be any progress. So we'll go to the next slide. He emphasizes this: truth is not opinion. This is again in reply to a question which that gentleman very sincerely puts to him. He says, do you mean to say that our leaders and teachers have been wrong in advocating and maintaining the ideal? This is the question that's put by the person there. He says, do you mean to say that our leaders and teachers have been wrong in advocating and maintaining the ideal? Then immediately Krishnamurti puts him a counter question and says, what do you think? Forget about the leaders and teachers and what they said. What do you think? Then he gives this answer and says, please, it is not a matter of understanding what another may say, but of finding out what is true. I'm not interested in the opinions of the leaders or teachers or anybody. What is the truth? And in that context, he says, truth is not opinion. Truth is not dependent on any leader or teacher. Our pursuit of the ideal is a vain struggle, a gratifying self-deception. Is it not? He says, the pursuit of an ideal is a vain struggle, a gratifying self-deception. You are only deceiving yourself. The understanding of the actual is possible only when the ideal, the what should be, is erased from the mind. That is, only when the false is seen as the false, the what should be is also the what should not be. See the point here? The question of projecting something and saying that this should be like that has to be completely erased from the mind. Then only the understanding of the actual is possible. That means you have to directly come in contact with it and see the false as the false. You have to see the false as the false. Sorry. You have to see the false as the false. Seeing the false as the truth. Therefore, he goes on to say, hey, the what should be also is what they should not be. See, because both are opinions. One person may say that it should be like this. The other person may say it should not be like this. So what is the difference between the two? There's no difference. Both are fictitious. Both are false. Both have no being. So the understanding of the actual is only possible when the ideal, the what should be, is erased from the mind. These are statements which are not meant for discussion or debate or argument or analysis. These are statements which have to be very deeply examined in oneself and see whether it is true or not. If it is not true for you, you throw it away. It doesn't matter whether it is Krishnamurti or somebody else or whoever is talking about it. If it is not true, you simply throw it away. Go on examining it and try to come to the truth on your own, not dependent on anybody. If we are him as a pointer in a particular direction. Now it is for us to walk in that direction, go deeply into it, understand it carefully. And if we find truth in that, we don't need to ask anybody for confirmation. If we find it to be false, then also we need to ask anybody. You need to simply drop it and continue your journey. It is an inward movement where you are trying to understand deeply in yourself what is the reality. The ideal, as he has earlier mentioned, is only a fictitious thing. It has no existence. Then we go to the next slide. To understand the actual, you must be in direct communion with it. Your relationship with it cannot be through the screen of the ideal or through the screen of the past, of tradition, of experience. To be free from the wrong approach is the only problem. See, as I mentioned earlier, and Krishnaji has repeatedly emphasized on this, that you have to shatter all the images we have created. All the images we have created have to be shattered. Because these images are nothing but our own opinions, our own ideas, our own ideals and our own projections. If you are seeing something through that screen, obviously your vision will be colored, your vision will be blinded, depending upon the transparency or opacity of the barrier of the screen. Your vision to that extent will be distorted. So the only way is to destroy this screen. The creation of ideal is actually a screen between you and the reality. And therefore, that understanding of the actual comes only when we are in direct communion. It is not communication. Communication is always indirect. Communion is always direct. Communion is becoming one with it, uniting with it, in union with it. So when you are in direct communion and not through the screen of the ideals, whether of the past or the tradition or your own experiences or whatever you may call it, that is still a screen. When you have a screen, in front of your eyes, you and me, we are not in contact with the reality, with the truth, with the actuality. And therefore, the screen is the biggest barrier. Approaching the whole issue through an ideal, he calls it as the wrong approach. So the only problem is the approach which we have adopted is wrong. So when the approach is wrong, obviously the outcome of it will also be wrong. The outcome of it will also be obviously wrong because the approach is wrong. The means to the ends. If the means is wrong, you can't have a right end at the end of it. You can't reach the right ends when the means are wrong. So that is the importance of this. The way of the mind is the way of life. The way of the mind is the way of life, not the ideal life, but the actual life of sorrow and pleasure, of deception and clarity, of conceit and the pose of humility. To understand the mind is to be aware of desire and fear. As I said, sometimes what happens is, if I go on elaborating on these statements, I may add to the confusion. So I'm not really interested in going on adding to what Krishnaji said. We are only mutually exploring to understand the whole thing from the right perspective. See, life as it is what we are concerned with. Not an ideal life or a life with something else. The actual life, the life we lead, is it not having all these elements of sorrow and pleasure, deception and clarity, conceit and the pose of humility? See, I don't know, earlier, during the British era, it was very important to close the letter or begin the letter by saying your humble servant. It was very fashionable in those days because we were really serving under the British, and therefore we need to always say I'm your very humble servant. That itself shows that it is only a pose of humility. We also do the same thing. When we are approaching somebody or when we are talking to somebody, especially in these television debates and all, he would say, "Sir, most respectfully, I want to submit." That's a clear indication that that fellow has no respect for you. So this is the pose. This is the conceit. This is the pose of humility. We are always living in this kind of life. We are in this kind of life. That is the way that needs to be examined. Therefore, he says the understand the mind is to be aware of desire and fear, because these are the two most powerful things that rule us. The two most powerful aspects or elements that rule us are desire and fear. You can examine it. You can carefully consider it. You will find that these are the major elements ruling our life. Some kind of desire pulling us here and there and making us move forward in some direction, and some kind of fear pulling us back. So therefore, he makes it very clear. If you want to understand the mind, you have to be aware of the desire and fear, which are the two operational aspects, which are the most important operational factors in our life. It's not the ideal. It's not the what you create as a goal for yourself. To know the mind, must you not be aware of its activities? The mind is only experience, not just the immediate, but also the accumulated. We have seen this earlier also. The mind is not only the experiences which we undergo immediately, but we have something called as accumulated experiences and sometimes what he calls as the racial inheritance. Humanity as a whole collectively has inherited so many factors. In fact, scientists go to say that your brain has developed based on this accumulated experience of the humanity as a whole. They divide it into 4 or 6 or any number of parts. They call the reptilian brain, they call the frontal lobe, they call the left brain, the right brain, whatnot, all those things. So the mind is the response to the present, which makes for the future. The future is nothing different from the past. You are only picking up something from the past and creating an ideal and projecting in the future. Because obviously something which is unknown to you, you cannot imagine. You cannot make something unknown as your future because unknown has no entity. Something which is unknown, I cannot take it as a part of it and then design the future. So therefore, the total process of the mind has to be understood, he says. Not in bits and pieces and fragments, but the total process of the mind has to be understood. Then, very interestingly, that gentleman puts a question. Where am I to begin? Where am I supposed to begin? And he gives a very, very pertinent answer. And that's why I put it in red. From the only beginning, you have to begin. To be is to be related, is it not? To be, that means to exist, is to be related. Without relationship, do we exist? No. If I am standing, I am related to the ground, isn't it? I can't stand in the air. Even if I stand in the air, I am depending on the air. So to exist is to be related, and relationship is life, and you have to begin there. Only in the mirror of relationship is the mind to be understood, and you have to begin to see yourself in that mirror. This is a very, very interesting and very beautiful analogy. The very, very apt, example of a mirror. You know, interestingly, the word for ideal in almost all the Indian languages is Adarsha. Adarsha means an ideal. You use that in Hindi, you use that in several South Indian languages also. Maybe in Kannada also it is Adarsha only. In Telugu it is Adarsha. In several of the North Indian languages, because the derivation is from the Sanskrit word. The Sanskrit means it also has this derivative meaning of Adarsha, means an ideal. But do you know what is the etymological meaning of this or the original meaning of this word Adarsha? The original meaning of this word Adarsha is mirror. Adarsha means that which shows completely. Asamantat, A means completely. Darsha means to show. So the Adarsha means to show completely. It is only the mirror that shows things as it is to the extent it can reflect. So you see, what is being seen in the mirror, it has acquired a derivative meaning of calling it as an ideal. You know, physically seeing in the mirror can also be very deceptive, because psychologists and psychiatrists have come to the conclusion after a lot of empirical studies that it seems one thinks one is 3 to 4 times more beautiful than what he is when he sees himself in the mirror. You see this? You see this joke? I don't see myself. My mind imagines that I am 3 or 4 times more beautiful than what I am actually appearing. So the actual appearance can also be deceptive. Krishnaji is not talking about that kind of deceptive mirror or deceptive vision, but he says only in the mirror of relationship. Only in the mirror of relationship is the mind to be understood. And you have to begin to see yourself in that mirror, in the mirror of relationship. That means to be aware of every action, every thought, every feeling, every word that comes out of us in relation to something, isn't it? It is in relation to somebody. It is in relationship to some event, something else. So if you are aware of it, that will reveal the truth to you, and that is the beginning. That is where you start. That is where you start with that. And that is the only way to start. There is no other way. And that's why he says, do you mean in my relationship with my wife, with my neighbor, and so on? Is that not a very limited process? The questioner is asking this. The person to whom Krishnamurti is speaking, he says, do you mean in my relationship with my wife, with my neighbor, and so on? Is that not a very limited process? And Krishnamurti makes a very insightful statement and says, what may appear to be small, limited, if approached rightly, reveals the fathomless. What may appear to be small, limited, if approached rightly, reveals the fathomless. Relationship is never narrow or small, with one or the many. Relationship is a complex process, and you can approach it pettily or freely and openly. Again, the approach is dependent on the state of the mind. So, how to approach rightly? Don't approach it in a petty manner. Approach it in a free and open manner. And that the approach you adopt also depends on the state of the mind. If your mind is agitated, your approach will also be agitated. Your perception will be agitated. Your relationship will be agitated. But if your mind is poised, if your mind is calm, if our mind is quiet and able to see things clearly as they are, with a very free and open mind, then that approach is the right approach. And if it is approached rightly, he says it will reveal the fathomless. It will reveal what is endless, which is limitless. Though the beginning may appear to be small and limited, but as you see, as your approach is right, the right approach means which is open and free, without any screens, without the interference of your own knowledge and experience, without your accumulated memory coloring the whole vision, then it will reveal the fathomless. And finally, I think we come to the last slide, where Krishnamurti very beautifully says, if you do not begin with yourself, where else will you begin? If you do not begin with yourself, where else will you begin? You can't begin with somebody else or somewhere else, at some other place, or some other time. It has to be with you and me, here and now. And the beginning is the ending. Once you begin, once you have the right approach to it, once you begin with yourself, you will see that the beginning is the ending, and the only place where you can start, where you can begin, is with yourself. Now, after saying this, the person to whom he is speaking makes a wonderful statement. I'll not describe or elaborate on that statement. I'll just read that statement and leave it. I see that there seem to be several questions on the chat. So I'll leave it. I'll just read this statement, which tells us that the listener, the questioner, has truly understood what Krishnaji is saying. And he says, I have wandered far afield. I have seen and done many things. I have suffered and laughed like so many others, and yet I had to come back to myself. I am like that sannyasi who set out in search of truth. He spent many years going from teacher to teacher, and each pointed out a different way. At last he wearily returned to his home, and in his own house was the jewel. I see how foolish we are, searching the universe for that bliss which is to be found in our own hearts when the mind is purged of its activities. You are perfectly right. I begin from where I started. I begin with what I am. Thank you so much. I'll stop this screen sharing and we'll go to the chat. The questions are should we have the book with us? I have commentaries on living, which part I have already answered that. There is a somebody is asking about building army. Krishnaji may not have foreseen bloodshed and massacre of 3 divisions of our unprepared army in 1962 by the Chinese. But today we come face to face on the border. Sir, I don't know the name of the person here, only his phone number or something is reflected. Sir, the point is, Krishnaji has actually seen 2 world wars. You are talking about the massacre of 1962 and unprepared army and all that. But he has been actually a witness to 2 world wars, number 1. Number 2, way back in 1935, he actually predicted that in a few years there will be a world war. This was discussed in one of our earlier talks which we discussed. In that he very clearly and very prophetically says that if one is sensitive, one can see that in 2 years or 5 years there will be a great war. And he's not talking about individual events and individual things, and he's not even talking about individual nations. We individually and collectively have to examine ourselves and see whether violence is not a part of us, whether greed, envy, jealousy, anger, frustration, depression, all these words which we use, are they not a part of us? When they are a part of each one of us, obviously the collective will only reflect that. See, for instance, if the body is poisoned, can anybody predict which organ will fail first and which organ will fail later? Where will there be an eruption in the body? When the whole body of humanity is poisoned, the eruption may come on the hand, the eruption may come on the land, the eruption may come on anything. that is unpredictable. So a war between two countries here or two countries there or two countries elsewhere or collectively of 3 or 4 countries at war with each other or participating in the whole process is the same thing. It is the same thing. The whole body is poisoned. What we are seeing as wars or violence is only a reflection of the violence in the individuals. The individual violence collectively in each one of us at some point or the other will project and come out as violence in the form of a tragedy, a war, or something else. So you have to perceive this whole thing of violence from a much deeper point of view and see whether each one of us, you and me, are we free of that violence? And violence is not in isolation. Violence could be a result of my greed. Violence could be a result of my ideologies. Violence could be a result of my thinking process itself. Because I am envious, because I am jealous, the action that comes out of that envy or jealousy is violence. So violence also needs to be looked into in the right context, and the whole perspective has to be seen. So this is what happens when we are not in a position to see the whole thing in the right perspective. We think that somebody is responsible for something. A truly great realized person realizes that any action of his which is coming out of ignorance is only going to contribute to the conflict and the violence in the world. Conflict in the world. It's not going to be something outside. He's talking from a much larger perspective. Then there is a question by Binaji. So the individuality comes from outside influences. So if I were to drop that, I would see the real truth. Now the point is, as I mentioned earlier also, the I and the society, or what you call outside influence or social influence, are an artificial division. That division is an artificial division. We are mutually strengthening ourselves continuously. The I, as we understand, is actually a product and result of the environment or the society, because I am conditioned from my birth. I am conditioned right from my birth. So continuously I am seeing that. So I have fallen prey to this. I have fallen into the trap right from my childhood. So it's not a question of dropping, but understanding the relationship between me and the environment, and coming to face with the that they are not two different things actually. Like a drop of water in an ocean, thinking that I am different from the ocean. A wave, a very traditional example is that the wave thinking, or the bubble in the ocean thinking that it is different from the ocean. It is not. Once you come face to face with that reality, you need not drop it separately. Once you come to understand that I am no different from the society and I am fully influenced by the society, I am contributing to that conflict and confusion, and the society is contributing to my conflict and confusion. So we are all in the same state. That reality has to strike us hard. Then from that, Krishnaji says, a new perception would come out. Till now we are stuck with this duality. Till now we are stuck with this duality of the me and the not me. But that's no longer valid. When that duality is not there, then you realize the truth of the matter, and that gives a different dimension and energy for you to perceive the truth as it is. Avinandan, this gentleman says, my understanding is that individuality is just a product of circumstance of life, and therefore Nothing to be very proud of. If we recognize this, we can expand our consciousness. Yeah, it is true in one way, because once you see that you are a product of the circumstances, that very perception tells you that you have been living in with a false notion that you are somewhat unique and separate from the society or the environment as a whole. That perception itself gives a true insight. And as I mentioned earlier, you would be able to see things from a different dimension altogether, which was not the case earlier. If the actual or the what is recognized and we find it brings suffering, where is the question of what is bringing suffering? The what is suffering.
Yes.
See, you are not facing the suffering. You are avoiding that what is. See, there need not be additional suffering. The very process of limitation is suffering.
Yeah.
See, for a truly discerning person, we see the constant change of things, isn't it? We constantly see the change happening. That is what is called as parinama, change. That causes anxiety. Change causes anxiety, isn't it? We are not sure of things. Obviously, that creates anxiety or frustration. And that causes suffering. And that suffering, we have to understand, is a product of the conflict between various states of our mind and the nature of things. So once you see that, you will come directly in face to face with that suffering. And you have to confront it directly. If the moment you come face to face with it, because it is unpleasant, you avoid it and you escape from it. That escape is only going to add to the confusion but not resolve that confusion. So you have to recognize or come face to face with it. And again, thinking of proceeding from there is a mental projection. That is an escape route. How do I proceed is an escape route. The moment, Krishnaji would often say, the moment you ask the question how, you are avoiding it. But if you are confronting, if you are coming face to face with the reality, that reality will reflect the whole truth to you, will show you the truth. And from that, a different dimension of action will spring forth. You're not asking for that dimension or asking for that new action to come. That is a natural consequence of direct perception. The fact of the matter is we don't have that perception. Now there is the same question by that gentleman, says Gandhi's non-violence is peaceful resolution of a huge problem facing the society. Still we debate the major reason why Brits left India in the envy, non-violent struggle of the masses led by Gandhi, or the fear of possible violence by the soldiers led by Netaji. So mass movement was not fictitious. In the same way, fear of violence was also not fiction. Now again, we are narrowing down these to some specific our own understanding of some specific events. See, let me put a counter question. Could Gandhi avoid the violence due to the mass migration after partition in 1947 when he was alive and there? Could he really do anything about it? Except for some small incident which triggered something, and he was on the Bangladesh, today's Bangladesh border. He was in Bengal at that time of partition. See, we are not understanding. Hello, there seems to be some echoing.
Yeah.
Okay, is it okay now? Is it okay? Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
So you see, the point is we are not discussing individual events and individual issues. These have happened. But whom do you call as mass? For example, there are so many people who are now analyzing and saying that what Gandhiji did was wrong. There were people who opposed him when he was alive also. There was people who opposed him when he started it also. And later on, those people were proved right also. I don't want to go into that because what happens is we'll be unnecessarily getting into a controversial discussion. As I said, these are not issues for controversies to be raised or discussions to be made. One single event I'll tell you, which doesn't have a controversy, but which Gandhiji himself recognized. You know that Chauri Chaura incident. There was an incident way back in 1921, if I remember right, called the Chauri Chaura incident, which was very beautifully depicted in the movie of Gandhi also. He suspended all his movements with that one particular incident. He suspended and he left the Congress. He resigned from the primary membership of Congress and he was away from the whole thing for 6 years. He did not return to the fold of the Congress till 1927 when the Simon Commission came to India. For 6 years he suspended because he said I was wrong. I never thought that this kind of non-cooperation and the movements which I started would take such a violent turn. And if you see that movie, Nehruji and all other leaders of that time went and persuaded him and said, no, you can't stop this movement now. You can't say that just because 4 policemen were killed in that Chauri Chaura incident. What is 4 people in 30 crores at that time? Then Gandhiji made a very pertinent reply. He says, go and tell that to the family members of those 4 persons who died. Don't look at things as numbers and statistics from a larger perspective, saying that 4 people do not matter in 30 crores. But for a wife, there is only one husband. But for the child of that policeman, there is only one father. There is only one son for the father of that policeman who has been killed. So you see, he was terribly upset with the thing. And he suspended all his activities. And he was away from the whole thing for 6 years. Because he saw a different dimension that his statements or his actions can lead to the death of somebody. Whether it is 1 individual or 10 individuals or 100 or a million individuals is not the issue. So these things have to be examined from a different dimension. We are narrowing it down to some historical things that have happened or some historical statements made by people or incidents as we understand. I kindly request you not to understand it in that concept. When Krishnaji says that the mass is a fiction, examine the statement. Whom do you call as a mass? Today, if some scheme is implemented by the government, any government for that matter, whether it is a state government or central government or any government, there are 100 people who are criticizing or saying that we did not receive any benefit or our group has been ignored. So when you go deep into the mass is not a homogeneous unit as I mentioned. It is divided into million pieces again. So only the politicians use this trick against us, saying that I am doing for the greater good, for the good of the masses and all, is a trick of the exploiter, of the politician, of whichever hue and color and dimension, or whichever party he may be. We are not interested in all that. Do we see that the mass, when you call it as mass, is a fiction? You are raising the frenzy. Lot of studies were done after the Second World War on why and how the German people behaved in this manner, who were considered to be very educated, very knowledgeable, very sane, very ordinary people, leashed out so much of cruelty on the Jews and the people during that time. And they couldn't really find an answer. Because deep down we are that. Deep down we are that. So instead of narrowing things to our national events or freedom movement or something like that, we have to look at it from the larger perspective where the individual is in himself having all these qualities, all these factors in some proportion or the other, and sometime or the other it will erupt and come out. The idea of any nation state, whether or Iran or China, Sri Lanka, India, is violent by itself. Yeah, Krishnaji has always been saying that nationalism is some kind of a tribal romanticism. I do not want to go into it much because that is a statement which needs an examination at a different level. I think we have already crossed our time by about 15 or 20 minutes. But the reasons for that can be analyzed, and I am not talking in terms of a debate or discussion on that issue. The whole point is, do we perceive what he is perceiving or not? If we are not perceiving it, we can reject it and have our own perception. There's no compulsion. As Krishnaji himself said, imposition of an idea on somebody is also violence. He does not want to impose his understanding of what he calls as nationalism on somebody. But you have to see the reality of it. Is it really promoting the welfare of humanity or not? Are we really contributing towards the so-called peace and prosperity in this world, or are we creating further confusion or not? Then there is a question. The idea of, does this approach to relationships need to be in the what is without past and filters? Then we'll see the fathomless intelligence eternal. That is what the statement is. But see, the point is, don't go about with this expecting to see the fathomless. You see the danger in it. If you think that you are going to see the fathomless by this kind of approach, that's again a play of the mind. The mind is playing a game there. What I want you to kindly do is look at each aspect of each relationship directly at that moment and see how you react to it, how you respond to it. You see that also. When somebody questioned Krishnaji about, you talk about attention, sir, but I see inattention. Then Krishnaji said, be attentive to that inattention also. So when you are perceiving something, you see, include your own response also in it. Obviously, your response will be based on the filters in the past. But if you become more and more aware of yourself also in the process and look at that relationship from each moment, from moment to moment, then you then there's that possibility of coming in contact with what he calls as the fathomless. There is some statement in the movie Kung Fu Panda. His search ends in an empty book in one part, in another in a mirror. The message is carried. The book he sought at page after page mirrors. The seekers fight their way here year after year, willing to pay the terrible price to see what is in that book. And when they fight, fling it open in blazing expectation of finding all the answers to all the lives, and what they find? Themselves. There is no book, no enlightenment outside ourselves. Most of the Buddhist thought is based on this, but to put this into practice is the challenge. Obviously, yes, I agree with that. And instead of classifying it as Buddhist or ancient Indian or some other this thing, we can find the truth about this. finding the truth about it is more important. Coming directly in contact with the reality, when there is a subsequent edition also by this lady, Miss Anu. The point I'm trying to make is, when you do not allow your past to interfere, that itself is a state of emptiness. And in that state, there is this possibility of coming into contact with something which is of a totally different dimension, which is timeless. Whether you call it as nothingness or fullness or completeness or non-dual, whatever it is, because what has been called by somebody as nothingness has been termed by somebody as completeness. Krishnamurti also sometimes uses the term fulfillment. Fulfillment is, being complete in oneself, being total in oneself. So it's a part of the same thing. What you find there, if you describe it, it is lost. If you describe it as nothingness or becoming empty or void or non-dual or anything, that's only a description. The description is not the described. The word is not the thing. These were the very famous statements of Krishnamurti. He repeatedly used to say, the word is not the thing. The description is not the described. So instead of holding on to that description or putting so many words into it, it is important for us to come to that perception. In a very jocular this thing, when sometimes we used to have this 2-day programs at the School of Ancient Wisdom, some of the participants wanted to say something and expand on what I am saying. Then I would humbly request them, sir, one speaker is sufficient to confuse all of us. We need not have 2 or 3 speakers adding to that confusion. So, see, sometimes what happens is our explanations can lead to confusion, and that's what is to be avoided. We need to see explanation, a mental explanation. If it gives you a deeper clarity, it is okay. But if it gives only a mental clarity, that is not sufficient, and that may be a hindrance to move ahead, to move forward. So let's not look at for mental clarity through words, but clarity of perception where there is no interference of the mind. I think that may be a better way to perceive things and a better approach to the whole issue. So there are no further questions. I think we have already exceeded our time. So thank you so much for patiently hearing
Thank you so
me
much,
and then
Mr. Paniji.